Hi, everyone. My name is Misha, and I'm the founder of Iranian Youth Connections. For those who aren't familiar, Iranian Youth Connections is a youth-led organization dedicated to creating a welcoming space for Iranian youth to connect and bond with one another, learn more about Iranian culture, and gain the skills to become successful leaders in their community. Through virtual interviews of successful Iranian role models, such as medical professionals, entrepreneurs, artists, educators, and more, we hope to promote Iranian diaspora and empower young Iranians. And I'm so excited for this episode to be joined by Phoenix Councilwoman Yassamin Ansari. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So before we get started, I would really appreciate it if you could tell everyone a little bit more about yourself, what you do, your passions.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Yassamin. I am a city councilwoman in Phoenix, Arizona. I was elected last March and have been serving in this position for a little bit more than a year. And basically what that means is along with 8 of my colleagues on the city council, I help run and make decisions for Phoenix, which is the 5th largest and fastest growing city in the country. I am a native of Phoenix. Although I was born in Seattle, but grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. Both of my parents are Iranian, and I've always been incredibly passionate about public service and politics. And I think that definitely has a lot to do with my Iranian identity and just the kinds of things I was surrounded by growing up. But yeah, right now I'm very lucky and privileged to be able to serve around 250,000 residents, work on everything from climate and transportation policy to housing and homelessness issues, to all of the bread and butter issues that a councilwoman works on, like streets and traffic and public safety and parks and recreation and all the rest. So working on making Phoenix a more sustainable and equitable place to live.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for that introduction. So first, I wanted to start off with talking a little bit more about your Iranian background and your Iranian identity and kind of how that's shaped you. So my first question is, as you mentioned, you're a second generation immigrant. I was wondering, throughout your career, throughout your childhood, how were you able to find the balance between maintaining your connection to your heritage and your background, while also, having to assimilate into American culture? How did you find that balance? What was that process like?
Honestly, I think for me, it felt pretty natural. I don't think I thought too much about it while it was happening. But I will say, I think my parents did a really good job with balancing both. They definitely really prioritized like learning Farsi as an example. So at home, my brother and I only spoke Farsi with my parents growing up. Actually, my mom like pretended until I was 9 or 10 years old that she didn't even know how to speak English. And then I finally was smart enough to catch on that she could somehow speak English with everybody else but me. But yeah, so we spoke Farsi growing up. And then my mom has always been very active in the Persian community in different ways. So like when I was in elementary school and middle school, she put on an annual Nowruz event specifically for kids. That was kind of like talent show. We'd take dance lessons and some people would perform on the piano or the violin and we'd have plays. And so I was always really excited about all of that, really proud of my Iranian culture. But, I also went to a public school and most of my good friends at school or whatnot were not Iranian. But I think it was a healthy balance between, my life at school and with my friends, but also being able to do all of these things that had to do with my Iranian culture. And I think speaking the language, I mean, I'm so grateful for that because obviously it's much easier to learn a language when you're a kid. And then just the connections that I think it helped me forge with my grandparents and with so many extended family members, even now has been amazing.
Another kind of follow-up question. I know, like, for myself being second generation and for, my other friends, it's like really hard to hold on to that Farsi language when you're like, from a very young age. Like we don't even have that first few years in Iran or anything where we're like constantly surrounded by English. How were you able to like keep up your Farsi? Did you attend Farsi school? And how do you like, or did you lose some of your language abilities? How has that been?
Yeah, so I did take I did take Farsi lessons. I had this like wonderful Iranian woman who was a teacher back in Iran. Not honestly, I'm not sure how my mom met her, but from when we moved here when I was 5, I took Farsi classes with her, first with a group, but then once she stopped doing that, we would go to her house. So my mom would drop me off for like 2-3 hours a week at her house, and we'd go through the textbook, like these little textbooks of first grade, second grade, third grade of reading and writing in Farsi. So that made a huge difference. And again, I think it was the very kind of strict policy of at home we're only speaking Farsi that up until I was 18, 19 years old, because that was the case, I think now, I still speak it fluently and I'm very, very comfortable. So yeah, it was just, it was, if my parents hadn't been as strict about doing that, I don't think I would have been as good at the language. Of course, I still could be much better. I think my reading and writing is pretty mediocre. But I can definitely get around. I also have had some fun experiences back when I was working at the United Nations. There was a BBC Persian reporter who I did a couple interviews with. That was really tough because a lot of the words that I would need to use to communicate the work I was doing, or even words like United Nations, the Secretary General, climate change, these were words I had never learned in Farsi, right? Because they're not day-to-day conversation. So in those cases, it was always funny. I would prep with the reporter for 20 minutes beforehand. He'd teach me the words and I'd have to keep saying them so I remembered. So yeah, it's kind of that upper level that's still difficult. But in general, that's kind of, I all gratitude goes to my parents for getting me to this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I've read about and heard stories of how some immigrant families, they kind of put in place the opposite rule where
Right.
you can't speak your native language in your house because they want their kids to assimilate. But I've kind of noticed a trend with most of the people I've interviewed where, I don't know, it seems like in Iranian families, maybe they're just more knowledgeable about the assimilation that happens. So yeah, I think that's really, it's important though. It's a very, I think, good thing to, carry with you. So next we can transition a bit more into your public policy work. I was wondering, so how did you first become interested in advocacy work? What was kind of your journey to the place you are today?
So I would say it started in middle school, high school. Growing up, my mom was also very interested in community service. So we started doing a lot of work with local refugee families who were from Somalia. So kind of like an adopt a family type model where, we took on a couple families. My mom really mentored the kids, and myself and my brother also would tutor and mentor these young kids who had just, been through such trauma. I think that kind of community service really, then when I went into high school, I was very focused on community service club. I started doing speech and debate, which got me very interested in foreign policy issues and just being on that side of things. I did public forum debate, and I absolutely loved it. So I think by the time I was, a teenager, I very much knew that I wanted to study something in the realm of politics. So by the time I later went to Stanford, I studied international relations. I did concentrations on the Middle East and international security. Thinking that I already spoke Farsi, I decided to learn Arabic and really wanted my area of expertise to be the Middle East. So I spent all 4 years of college studying Arabic, and I really got to work on my passion for advocacy for refugees at that time, because it was also the real peak of when the crisis in Syria was happening. And I was doing a study abroad program in Jordan when I was a junior in college. So did a lot of work volunteering at some of the refugee camps on the border of the two countries, did a lot of work raising money and doing advocacy with universities around the country to kind of call attention to the atrocities that were being made, and trying to help in any way. Obviously very minimal, but yeah, it was just, I think it's been kind of in my blood, and with community service being something that my mom has always been really passionate about. And then when I transitioned into my career after college, I fell into doing climate change work and advocacy. And that's pretty much what I've been doing since then.
Mhm. I love that story. I feel like I have very similar passions to you. So that's really interesting. But do you think that like, I don't know, your Iranian identity and like any values you had or like conversations you had with your parents kind of sparked that interest in like Middle East advocacy specifically?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think my parents were probably a bit surprised. I think the Iran piece made sense to them, but maybe the rest of it was a little bit foreign, but they were very supportive for sure. I mean, I did a study abroad program in Jordan and one in Morocco, and they actually came to visit me both times. And, for me, I think it's interesting. Like, obviously, I think if we've had conversations with our parents or grandparents or people in that age range, I think there's a lot of like stereotypes or misunderstandings, even with the other Middle Eastern countries. And that always was something that really bothered me because I think as an American, like when I look at Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, all these countries, like we have so much more in common than we do differences. And so I loved it. I felt so at home, in those places and with, folks who speak Arabic. Like I feel like we're part of the same culture really, with minor differences. So that was always just interesting. I think it was a way for me, honestly, to get closer to my Iranian identity, focusing on the Middle East, by doing those things. I felt closer to that and I really enjoyed it. So like, especially, there was a trip I took to Greece to some refugee camps, and there were a lot of Afghan refugees there.
Oh,
And I felt like so at home talking to them because obviously the language is very, very similar. And just like very, culture wise the same as well. So and I'll tell a story of some of the work now, but we have a lot of Afghans now who have recently evacuated and come to Phoenix that my office has been working with, which has also been a good way to tie all of those interests together now in my current role.
mhm. That's amazing. So were you able to use like the Arab language skills you use like in your study abroad programs and like throughout the work that you've been doing?
I did at the program. So I spent like all of college studying Arabic. By the time I lived in Morocco, I think that was the summer before my senior year, I don't want to say fluent, but I was very advanced. Like it was through a State Department program, and they actually like do strict like examinations and testing and stuff. And so I think I tested as like advanced low or advanced medium. So I was really, really good. But unfortunately, my job after college ended up being at the UN in New York, where I did not utilize my Arabic at all. And I very, very sadly will say that like that is largely gone. I mean, I can understand it when I hear it and I'm around it, but like when I start to speak, it becomes a jumble. Somehow Spanish sometimes comes out. Like it's very weird. And that's why, like going back to our conversation at the beginning, I think the learning Farsi as a kid, like I will never forget Farsi because it's just like, it's like a habit to me. But a language that I learned when I was between 18 and 22, because I haven't been practicing it, is largely non-existent now, which
Yeah.
is sad.
Yeah. No, but I think it's so cool that you got those experiences. I'm actually leaving in a week through the State Department to Tajikistan.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So it's also interesting. I wasn't even like, I knew that like the Persian language, right? There's like Farsi. I knew about like Pashto and Dari, but I didn't even know really about Tajiki much at all. So I think
Right.
it's so interesting too that there's like, so many subcategories.
Yeah.
But would you be able to elaborate a bit more about what your office is doing with the Afghan refugees?
Something that's kind of always bothered me a little bit is that oftentimes, people, we tend to, as Iranians, we tend to have our own Nowruz celebration. And like, we think it's just our holiday when really it's celebrated by 300 million people around the world, including Afghans and people from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and parts of India and I'll be like all over. So I decided I wanted to host like a much broader, more inclusive Nowruz.